It was a gray morning in Geneva, the kind where the sky seems to press down on the city like a heavy blanket. Inside the United Earth Council chamber, the air was still, too still for a room that had once echoed with shouting, pleading, and the clatter of last-minute negotiations. But not today. Today there was only the quiet hum of climate control and the soft rustle of papers being set aside. For decades the world had been slipping. Not all at once, but slowly, like a boat taking on water through 1,000 tiny cracks. Crops failed more often than they grew. Coastlines vanished under rising seas. Heat waves baked cities into silence. Governments tried to fix things, of course. They signed agreements, promised change, built walls against floods and fires. But it was never enough. The planet was tired, and it was showing. Now, after years of emergency summits and desperate plans, the Council had run out of options. They weren't meeting to debate anymore. They were meeting to decide how to say goodbye. At the front of the room, a woman from West Africa stood at the podium. Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she clicked through the final slides of her presentation. Satellite images showed forests turned to dust, rivers shrunk to cracked mud, and oceans bleached white from dying coral. Graphs painted a future too grim to ignore. By 2060, Earth might only support 500 million people, if they were lucky. That was less than 1/10 of what the planet once held. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She just stated the facts one after another, like stones dropped into a deep well. When she finished, she stepped back without looking at anyone. No one clapped. No one argued. They just sat there, staring at their hands or the floor or the empty space between them. Then came the vote. The motion was simple. Officially declare Earth no longer viable as humanity's home and shift all remaining resources toward off-world settlements. On the Moon, Mars, and the orbital habitat slowly spinning in space. It wasn't about giving up. It was about surviving somewhere else. The delegates raised their paddles, green for yes, red for no. The count came in, 112 in favor, 78 against, 3 abstained. A majority. Not a landslide, but enough. The gavel tapped once, soft, final, and just like that, Earth was exiled. No one stood up. No one shouted, "This is wrong," or "We can still fix this." There were no dramatic walkouts, no tearful goodbyes. People simply gathered their things, nodded quietly to their neighbors, and filed out through the tall glass doors into the damp Geneva air. Outside, the city looked normal. Cars moved. Streetlights flickered on. A cafe across the square served coffee to a few early customers. But something had changed. Everyone knew it. The world hadn't ended with a bang or a war or a meteor. It ended with a vote in a quiet room while the rain started to fall. Back inside, a janitor began cleaning the chamber. He'd heard the news on his earpiece during his break. He didn't say anything as he wiped down the desks where the fate of the planet had just been sealed. He just worked slowly, carefully, as if the room itself deserved respect, even in its final hour. Later that evening, in a small apartment overlooking Lake Geneva, an old man sat by the window with a cup of tea gone cold. He'd been a climate scientist once, decades ago, back when people still believed technology could save them. Now he watched the lights of boats glide across the dark water and wondered if his grandchildren would ever see this lake again, or if they'd only know it from stories. He didn't feel angry. Not really. More like tired. Like the whole human race had been running a race it didn't know it was in. And now at the finish line, everyone just stopped and sat down. Meanwhile, in government offices across the globe, the machinery of departure began to turn, not with panic but with eerie calm. Evacuation plans that had been drafted in secret for years were finally activated. Priority lists were updated, transport routes mapped. Families would be chosen by lottery, by skill, by need. Not everyone would leave. Not even close, but those who could, would. In a village in Bangladesh, a farmer stood knee-deep in what used to be his rice field. The salt water had crept in years ago, killing the soil. His children had already been accepted into the relocation program. They'd leave next month. He wouldn't go with them. "Someone has to stay," he told his wife the night before, "to remember how it was." In a high-rise in Toronto, a teenager packed a single backpack. She'd won a spot on the next shuttle to the lunar colony because of her coding skills. Her parents weren't chosen. They hugged her at the door, not saying much. What was there to say? Be safe felt too small. "We'll miss you" felt too big. So they just held each other for a long time, listening to the wind outside. Back in Geneva, the council building stood empty. The lights were off. The flags outside hung limp in the drizzle. No press vans waited. No crowds gathered. The decision that changed everything had come and gone without fanfare, and that was the strangest part. People expected chaos, riots, desperation, but instead, there was a kind of quiet acceptance, like when a loved one is very sick, and everyone knows the end is near, so they stop fighting and just sit by the bedside, holding hands because deep down everyone had known for years. They'd seen the wildfires on the news. They'd tasted the dust in the air. They'd watched their hometowns dry up or flood or burn. The vote didn't surprise them. It just made it official, so they didn't scream. They didn't blame. They just began to pack. Some cried in private. Others worked through the night trying to finish one last project, one last letter, one last meal with family. But no one made a scene. No one demanded a second chance. Maybe because they knew there wasn't one. The Earth wasn't being destroyed by a villain. It was being retired like an old engine that had run too long, worn smooth by time and use. And humanity, its only child, was finally being sent away to find a new home. As night fell over Geneva, the last security guard locked the council doors. He paused for a moment, looking up at the stars, faint but clear through the thinning clouds. Somewhere out there, new cities were being built. New lives would begin. But here, on this quiet, wounded planet, the story was winding down, and not with a word, not even a whisper, just silence. After the vote, the world didn't explode. There were no riots in the streets, no governments collapsing overnight. Instead, something quieter happened, something almost gentle, like the slow closing of a door that had been left open for too long. People just started getting ready to leave. It wasn't fast. It wasn't chaotic. It was organized, almost routine, like preparing for a long trip no one really wanted to take but knew they had to. Governments rolled out the plans they'd been quietly drafting for years. Lottery systems picked who would go first. Priority went to the young, the skilled, the essential. Doctors, engineers, teachers, farmers who knew how to grow food in thin soil or recycled air. Everyone else waited, hoping their number would come up before it was too late. In Mumbai, an old woman stood on her balcony watching the monsoon clouds gather. Her grandchildren had been chosen in the first wave. They'd leave in 3 days. She'd help them pack. Clothes, photos, a small clay lamp from the family shrine. She didn't cry. She just folded each item carefully as if tucking them into a dream. When they hugged her goodbye, she whispered, "Take care of the sky for me." They didn't understand, but they nodded anyway. In São Paulo, a street artist climbed onto a rooftop with a can of paint. The city was half empty now, windows boarded, shops shuttered. He painted a giant jaguar leaping across a crumbling wall, its eyes bright, its body strong. Below it, in small letters, he wrote, "We were here." He didn't sign it. He didn't need to. The whole city was his signature now. What was strange wasn't the leaving. It was the silence around it. No one shouted about fairness. No one stormed government offices demanding a spot on the shuttles. Maybe because everyone knew the truth. There weren't enough seats for everyone, and arguing wouldn't change that. So people made peace with it in their own ways. In a village in Kenya, a schoolteacher gathered her students one last time. Most of them wouldn't be leaving. Their families weren't on the lists. But she still taught them that morning, math, stories, songs. At the end, she gave each child a seed from her garden. "Plant it," she said. "Even if no one sees it grow, it matters." The children held the seeds in their small hands like tiny promises. Trains began running again, not for tourists or commuters, but for departure. Long maglev lines carried people from inland cities to coastal launch zones. The cars were quiet. Some passengers slept. Others stared out the windows at fields turning brown, rivers shrinking to threads, forests thinning like old hair. No one took selfies. No one played loud music. It was as if the whole world had lowered its voice. In a small town in Canada, a man loaded his truck with tools, books, and a single framed photo of his parents. He wasn't chosen to leave, but his daughter was. He drove her to the regional hub himself. On the way, they didn't talk much. Just pointed out old landmarks, the diner where she got her first job, the hill where they used to watch meteor showers. When they reached the checkpoint, he hugged her tight and said, "Make sure you look back sometimes." She promised she would. Back in cities, neighborhoods emptied like sand through fingers. Lights stayed off. Mail piled up. But people didn't loot or vandalize. If anything, they took care of what was left behind. A neighbor watered another's garden. A teenager fixed a broken fence for an elderly couple who'd decided to stay. There was a strange kindness in the air, like everyone knew this was the last chapter and they wanted to end it well. Some chose to stay on purpose. Not because they couldn't leave, but because they wouldn't. A fisherman in Iceland kept his boat in the water, even though the fish were gone. "The sea remembers us," he told a reporter who came by. Someone should remember it too. In the Australian outback, a nurse stayed behind to care for the few who refused to go, mostly elders who said, "I was born here. I'll die here." She didn't argue. She just made sure they weren't alone. The shuttles launched every few days, great silver arcs rising into the sky from Baikonur, Kourou, Cape Canaveral. People gathered on hills and rooftops to watch them go. No cheers, no waving, just silent watching, hands in pockets, faces turned upward. Children asked, "Will we ever come back?" Adults didn't answer. They just held their hands tighter. Even the animals seemed to sense something. Birds changed their migration paths. Dogs followed strangers to the transport centers, as if hoping to be taken along. In one town, a stray cat sat every morning outside the empty schoolhouse waiting for children who never came. Yet through it all, life went on. Just slower, softer. Markets still opened, though with fewer stalls. Buses still ran, though half empty. People still cooked meals, told jokes, held hands at night. Because even when the end is coming, you still need to eat. You still need to love. One evening, in a nearly abandoned apartment building in Berlin, a musician played piano in the courtyard. No audience. No recording. Just music drifting through open windows. Neighbors leaned out listening. Some cried. Some smiled. No one spoke. The notes hung in the air like fireflies, brief, beautiful, gone too soon. And that was the heart of it. People weren't giving up. They were letting go, with grace, with dignity, with quiet courage. They packed not just bags, but memories. A child's drawing. A wedding ring. A jar of soil from the backyard. These weren't just things. They were proof that life had happened here. That joy had existed even in the hard times. As the weeks passed, the roads grew quieter. The airport stopped buzzing. The cities began to breathe again, not with people but with space. Vines crept over sidewalks. Weeds pushed through cracks in the pavement. Nature, patient and persistent, started to reclaim what was left behind. But the humans who remained didn't see it as loss. They saw it as witness. They knew they were the last ones to walk these streets, to taste this rain, to feel this wind. And so they walked slowly. They looked closely. They listened. Because soon there would be no one left to remember how the light fell through the trees in autumn, or how the ocean smelled after a storm, or how a baby's laugh could fill an entire room. So they carried it all inside them. The good, the hard, the ordinary magic of being alive on Earth. And when the time came for the final shuttles to lift off, those who stayed didn't wave goodbye. They just stood still and let the silence speak for them. The night before the last shuttle was set to leave Earth, something unexpected happened. Not a protest, not a breakdown, not even a speech. Just a broadcast, quiet, simple, and meant for no one in particular, yet for everyone all at once. The United Earth Council had approved it days earlier. One final transmission, sent out not just to the colonies in orbit and on Mars, but into deep space, into the void, as if hoping the universe might one day understand what had lived here. It wasn't a message of warning or pride. It was a collection, 10,000 hours of human life edited down to a single 24-hour loop. Music, voices, laughter, recipes, lullabies, street noise, birds at dawn, a baby's first cry, an old man telling a story by firelight. No one announced it with fanfare. There were no countdowns or live hosts. At exactly 6 p.m. local time across every time zone, every working screen, phones, public displays, home TVs, even the small monitors in transport hubs, flickered to life with the same soft chime. And then it began. In a nearly empty apartment in Reykjavik, a fisherman sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. He hadn't planned to watch. He'd spent the day mending nets he'd never use again. But when the chime sounded, he looked up. On the screen, a woman's voice, warm, familiar, began singing an old folk song from his childhood. It was his wife. Not an actress. Not a recording from an archive. Her actual voice pulled from a community radio interview she'd done years ago, just weeks before she passed. He hadn't heard it since. He didn't move. He just listened, tears rolling down his cheeks without shame, as if the song had reached across time to hold him one last time. Across the ocean, in a schoolhouse in rural Kenya, a teacher gathered the few children left in the village. They sat on the floor, wrapped in blankets, watching the broadcast on a solar-powered projector. One moment showed kids playing soccer in a dusty field, just like theirs. The next, a grandmother kneading dough while humming. The children didn't speak. They just watched, eyes wide, as if seeing ghosts of a world they'd only heard about. In São Paulo, the street artist who'd painted the Jaguar sat alone on his rooftop. The city below was dark, most power grids shut down except for emergency lines. But his phone still worked. He played the broadcast through small speakers. When a clip came on of street musicians playing samba in Rio, crowds dancing, drums pounding, he closed his eyes and swayed slightly, as if the rhythm could carry him back to a time when joy didn't feel like a memory. People didn't gather in crowds to watch. They stayed in their homes, their shelters, their quiet corners. This wasn't entertainment. It was remembrance. And remembrance is a private thing. In a coastal town in Japan, an elderly woman lit a single candle and placed it by her window. On her tablet, the broadcast played softly, a recording of temple bells ringing at sunrise, followed by the sound of rain on bamboo. She closed her eyes and remembered walking those gardens with her father when she was small. She hadn't been back in 50 years. But in that moment, she was there again. What made the broadcast so powerful wasn't the grand moments, the symphonies or famous speeches, but the ordinary ones. A father teaching his son to tie a shoe, a market vendor calling out prices, the sizzle of onions in a pan, the sound of pages turning in a library. These were the things that made up a life. Not the wars or the wonders, but the daily acts of being human. And for the first time in years, people weren't thinking about survival. They were thinking about meaning. In a refugee processing center near the Kazakh steppe, a young woman waited for her final health check before boarding the last shuttle. She'd spent weeks numb, just going through the motions. But when she heard a clip of children laughing in a playground, she broke down. Not from sadness, but from recognition. That sound, pure, unguarded joy, was something she hadn't heard in years. She pressed her hands to her ears, not to block it out, but to keep it inside. The broadcast didn't try to explain or justify. It didn't say, "This is why we failed," or "This is what we lost." It simply said, "This is who we were." And in that honesty, there was peace. As night deepened, fewer screens stayed on. Some ran out of power. Others were turned off gently, as if tucking the world in for sleep. But those who kept watching saw something unexpected near the end. Silence. Not static. Not blackness. Just 10 full minutes of natural sound recorded in a temple garden in Kyoto, on the very last day anyone lived there. Wind moving through bamboo. Distant rain. A single bird calling. No humans, no voices. Just earth, breathing on its own. For many, that was the hardest part. Not the music or the memories, but the quiet after. The sound of a world continuing without them. In Geneva, the old climate scientist sat by his window again. The broadcast had ended hours ago, but he still stared at the dark lake. He thought about all the data he'd spent his life collecting, the graphs, the models, the warnings no one heeded in time. But tonight, none of that mattered. What mattered was the lullaby his mother used to sing, the smell of wet grass after summer rain, the way his dog used to bark at squirrels. Those were the truths no spreadsheet could capture, and maybe, just maybe, those were the only things worth saving. By dawn, the broadcast was over. The screens went dark. The last shuttle stood ready on the launch pad, its engines humming softly in the cold morning air. There would be no speeches before liftoff, no final goodbyes over loudspeakers. The crew had already boarded. The few remaining passengers, mostly medical staff and engineers, walked up the ramp quietly carrying small bags, faces calm. Down below, a handful of people watched from a distance. No tears, no waving, just standing there, hands in pockets. eyes on the sky, and as the engines roared to life and the shuttle rose, slow at first, then faster, cutting through the clouds like a needle through fabric, no one spoke. They just listened to the sound of leaving. And then, once it was gone, to the silence that followed. A silence not of emptiness, but of respect. Because sometimes the deepest farewells aren't said with words. They're held in the heart and released with a breath. By 2051, Earth was quiet, not dead, but resting. The cities still stood, though vines now curled around lampposts and trees grew through cracks in the pavement. Rivers ran clearer than they had in a century. Birds nested in abandoned office buildings. The air smelled different, cleaner, wilder, like after a long rain that never quite ends. Only a few million people remained. Not because they'd been left behind by accident, but because they'd chosen to stay. They weren't rebels or outcasts. They were caretakers, archivists of absence. They called themselves the Earth Stewardship Corps, but most just thought of themselves as the ones who stayed to say goodbye properly. In Nairobi, the woman who'd presented the final climate report to the council now walked through overgrown streets every morning. She wore simple clothes, carried a solar-powered tablet, and spoke softly to the few others who lived in the city. Her job wasn't to fix anything. There was nothing left to fix but to witness. She recorded how baboons explored empty supermarkets, how wildflowers bloomed in parking lots, how the wind sounded when it passed through a silent subway tunnel. She didn't do it for history books. She did it because if no one remembered how Earth healed itself, then the whole story would be lost. In the ruins of Mumbai, a retired engineer kept the last solar grid running, not for people, but for the water pumps that fed the few remaining community gardens. He'd rigged a system to collect rainwater from rooftops and filter it through old ceramic pipes. Every week he checked the tanks, cleaned the filters, and left fresh water in marked containers for the stray dogs and cats that still roamed the streets. He didn't expect thanks. He just believed that kindness didn't stop just because people were gone. In the American Midwest, a former schoolteacher lived in a farmhouse surrounded by fields slowly turning back into prairie. She grew vegetables in raised beds, saved seeds in labeled jars, and kept a journal, not of events, but of small wonders. April 3 saw a fox at dawn. It didn't run, just looked at me like we were old friends. She mailed her journals to the lunar archives every few months via drone, though she doubted anyone read them. Still, she wrote, because someone had to say life continued, beauty remained. These people didn't live in fear or sadness. They lived with purpose. Their days had rhythm. Water the gardens, check the solar panels, walk the perimeter, record observations, share a meal. At night, they gathered around small fires or battery-powered radios, sharing stories not of what was lost, but of what they'd seen that day. A deer drinking from a broken fountain, a storm clearing the sky, the first fireflies of summer. They knew they wouldn't be rescued. They wouldn't be replaced. When they were gone, Earth would go on without human hands to shape it. And that was okay. In fact, it felt like a kind of healing, for the planet and for them. Meanwhile, far above, in orbiting habitats and on the red plains of Mars, the refugees built new lives. They grew food under artificial suns, recycled every drop of water, and argued over who got extra oxygen credits. They were grateful to be alive, but they carried a quiet ache, a homesickness for a world they could never return to. Children born in domes asked, "What's a real tree?" Or did it really rain every day? Their parents would show them videos, but it wasn't the same. You can't feel wind through a screen. Back on Earth, the caretakers sometimes found messages left behind, notes tucked in library books, voice recordings on old phones, paintings on boarded-up walls. One day, in an empty school in Kyoto, someone discovered a chalkboard still bearing a math problem from the last day of class. Beneath it, in small handwriting, "I hope you find a better world." They left it untouched, let the dust settle over it like a blanket. The Stewardship Corps didn't try to rebuild. They didn't power up factories or restart internet towers. Their mission was simple: keep the lights on just enough to honor what was and let nature do the rest. They maintained the seed vaults in the mountains, not because they expected to plant them, but because those tiny packages held the memory of wheat, rice, tomatoes, of meals shared, of harvests celebrated. They kept the last weather stations running not for forecasts but as a record. This is how the sky changed. This is how the seasons returned. In Iceland, the fisherman still took his boat out every morning, even though he rarely caught anything. He'd sit in the quiet bay watching seals play near the shore, listening to the gulls. He'd talk to the sea like it was an old friend. "You'll be fine," he'd say. "You were here long before us. You'll be here long after." And the sea in its endless way would answer with waves. Time passed differently now. Without news cycles or deadlines, days blended like watercolors. People marked time by the moon, by the bloom of a certain flower, by the return of migrating birds. Birthdays weren't celebrated with cake, but with a shared meal and a story from the past. Funerals were quiet, just a body wrapped in cloth. Returned to the soil under a tree with a single song, and still, they cared. When a storm knocked out a power line in Lisbon, 2 caretakers walked 10 miles to fix it. Not because anyone needed the electricity, but because it felt wrong to let things fall apart without trying. When a wild dog showed up limping in Cairo, a former vet spent weeks nursing it back to health, even though she knew it might never trust humans again. They did these things not for reward, but because being human meant caring, even when no one was watching. One evening, in the shadow of the Andes, a small group gathered around a campfire. They'd come from different corners of the continent, meeting once a year by old radio signal. No agenda, just company. They shared dried fruit, told jokes, and watched the stars, brighter now without city lights to drown them out. Someone played a flute made from bamboo. The tune was simple, old, and full of longing. No one spoke for a long time after it ended. They didn't need to. They knew they were the last witnesses, the final keepers of a world that had given everything to its children, even when they didn't deserve it. And so they stayed, not out of hope for return, but out of love. Because someone had to be there when Earth finally took a deep breath. And someone had to say, softly, "It's okay. Rest now." 100 years passed. The colonies thrived, not perfectly but steadily. Cities grew under domes on Mars. Orbital rings spun quietly around Earth, home to millions who'd never felt real rain or walked on soil that wasn't recycled. Children learned about Earth in school, but it felt like a fairy tale. Green skies, oceans you could swim in, trees that reached higher than buildings. To them, it was myth more than memory. In 2147, the United Terran Assembly met to discuss a simple question. Should they go back? Probes had been watching Earth for decades. The data was clear. Forests had returned. Rivers ran clean. The air was breathable again. Wildlife flourished in places once choked by concrete. The planet had healed, not because humans fixed it, but because they finally left it alone. Some argued it was time to return. Not to take over, but to visit, to learn, to reconnect. Others said it was too risky, too expensive, too emotional, too soon. "We've built a new home," one delegate said. "Why dig up ghosts?" The vote was close, but in the end, the motion failed. Earth would remain off limits. A protected zone, a monument. Most people accepted the decision without protest. Life on Mars was hard enough. Water rationing, radiation shielding, the constant hum of life support. Who had time to dream of a blue planet they'd never see? But not everyone forgot. On Luna Colony Gamma, a young archivist worked in the deep storage vaults, miles beneath the moon's surface, where humanity's oldest digital records were kept. His job was dull, checking data integrity, updating file formats, making sure nothing was lost to time. He didn't mind. He liked the quiet, and he liked stories, especially the ones no one else read anymore. One day, while sorting through a batch of unopened capsules labeled Final Earth Transmissions 2051, he found one with no description, just a serial number and a faded sticker that read, "Do not open until silence is understood." Curious, he plugged it into a secure terminal. The system asked for a clearance code. He didn't have one. But the file was so old the security protocols had decayed. After a few tries, it opened. Inside was no speech. No manifest. No list of regrets. Just a single audio file titled Kyoto Garden Final Day. He put on headphones, pressed play, and leaned back in his chair. At first, nothing. Just soft wind. Then the gentle creak of bamboo swaying. Distant rain tapping on stone. A bird, maybe a thrush, calling once, twice. The sound of water trickling over rocks. No voices, no music. Just Earth alone, breathing. He listened for 12 minutes straight. When it ended, he sat still, eyes closed, as if waking from a dream he didn't want to leave. He played it again. And again, that night he didn't sleep. He walked through the sterile corridors of the lunar base, past glowing panels and humming air filters, and stepped into the observation deck. Through the thick glass, Earth hung in the blackness, blue-white whole. Not a myth, not a memory, a real place. Alive. He thought about the people who'd stayed behind, the ones who chose to witness the end not with anger but with care. He thought about the quiet broadcast, the empty streets, the last shuttle rising into the sky without a word. And for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a Martian or a lunar citizen. He felt like someone who belonged to Earth, even if he'd never set foot on it. The next day, he didn't report the file. He copied it onto a personal drive, encrypted it, and shared it with a few trusted friends, other archivists, teachers, artists. Not to spread it widely, but to pass it on quietly, like a secret worth keeping. Soon, small listening circles formed in hidden corners of the colonies. People gathered in dim rooms, put on headphones, and listened to the sound of a garden on a rainy morning a century ago. No one spoke afterward. They just sat together in the quiet as if honoring something sacred. Back on Earth, no one knew any of this. The planet continued its slow, steady healing. Wolves roamed the ruins of Paris. Elephants walked through what was once Nairobi. Coral reefs rebuilt themselves in seas once choked with plastic. The caretakers were long gone now, buried under trees returned to the soil they'd tended. But their work remained. The seed vault stood sealed. The weather station still sent silent data. The gardens they'd planted had gone wild, feeding birds and insects and new generations of life. Earth didn't miss humanity. It never had. It simply carried on. Patient, ancient, forgiving. Yet in those quiet listening circles across the solar system, something shifted. People began to speak differently about Earth, not as a failed experiment, but as a teacher. Schools added new lessons, not just how to survive on Mars, but how to listen, how to leave space for other life, how to walk gently. A new phrase started appearing in poetry and songs. Remember the silence. It didn't mean emptiness. It meant respect. It meant knowing when to step back. It meant understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is leave and let something heal. Years later, another vote would come. And this time it would pass. A small team would return, not to live but to visit, to walk barefoot on soil, to drink from a stream, to sit in a garden and listen, but that was still far off. For now, in the quiet of a lunar archive, a young person pressed play one more time, wind, rain, bamboo, a single bird. And in that sound, the whole story of Earth, its pain, its beauty, its quiet strength, lived on, not in monuments or museums, but in a moment of stillness, shared, remembered, honored. The exile had ended long ago, but the silence, that was the gift they finally learned to receive.